In his last book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, Michael Pollan covered the quandary of choosing the food we eat and the path the food followed from farm to table. In a book that also blamed corn for America's problem with obesity, Mr. Pollan is a brave man to now come to Iowa. But we welcome him and his latest book, In Defense of Food, An Eater's Manifesto. This time he explores the confusion over food's nutritional value and what exactly does that mean. A diet based on quantity rather than quality has ushered a new creature onto the world stage, the human being who manages to be both overfed and undernourished, says Pollan. The New York Times' Janet Maslin says a tough, witty, cogent rebuttal to the proposition that food can be reduced to its nutritional components without the loss of something essential. In this lively and valuable book, he assails some of the most fundamental tenets of nutritionism. Some of this reasoning turned up in Mr. Pollan's best-selling Omnivore's Dilemma, but In Defense of Food is a simpler, blunter, and more pragmatic book, one that really lives up to the manifesto in its subtitle. Michael Pollan is the author of 4 previous books, The Omnivore's Dilemma, A Natural History of 4 Meals, which was named one of the 10 best books of 2006 by the New York Times and the Washington Post, The Botany of Desire, A Plant-Eye View of the World, A Place of My Own, and Second Nature. Pollan served for many years as executive editor of Harper's Magazine and is now the Knight Professor of Science and Environmental Journalism at the University of California at Berkeley. He is also a longtime contributor to the New York Times Magazine. And this book, In Defense of Food, is now #1 on the New York Times bestseller list as of today. This is Sunday, January 13th, 2008. Please welcome Michael Pollan to Live from Prairie Lights. Please welcome Michael Pollan to Live from Prairie Lights.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Let me see if I can adjust this microphone. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
It's loud enough in the back? Great. Well, thank you. No? Can you make it a little louder? Thank you, Julie, for that very nice introduction. It's wonderful to be back in Iowa and feel relatively safe. As you know, I spent... How many people here read Omnivore's Dilemma? Wow. Okay. Well, I spent a lot of time in Iowa working on that. I was on the other side of the state in Jefferson County, and it was a food desert at the time. I mean, the come and go is like where you could find something to eat. And there's clearly something very different going on here. But all the aspersions I cast on corn, I do want to make an apology. Corn, as we're having it today, as popcorn, is absolutely terrific food. Corn as food is, I have no quarrel with. It's corn as industrial raw material that I think gets us into trouble. What I'd like to do this afternoon is tell you a little bit about this book and what I discovered in the course of this exploration, and start perhaps by telling you how I came to write it. It really did grow out of the Omnivore's Dilemma, and the kinds of questions I was hearing from audiences when I went out speaking about that book last year and the year before that. I kept running into this reader who would come up to me and say, I'm about halfway through your book, and I'm afraid to go any farther. And I would say, why? What do you mean? It has a happy ending. And they would say, well, because every time I turn the page, there's something else I shouldn't be eating. And I'm afraid if I get to the end, I'll starve. Now, for a writer trying to have a long career, expiring readers are a really bad idea. So I thought I would try to write a book that would help clarify this question about, now that we know something about the food system, now that we've kind of gone into the belly of the beast, which I tried to do in Omnivore's Dilemma, how should we eat? How can we eat? And by the way, why are we so confused about this procedure that so many creatures handle without much anxiety at all? As I looked at that question, trying to really get a handle on our food confusion, I came to the conclusion that, and I'm sorry if I'm not making eye contact with you, but I'm thinking of you, that our way of thinking about food, our food ideology, has really become a big part of the problem. And I call this ideology nutritionism. It's an ideology and not a science. That's why it's an ism and not just nutrition or nutrition science. But it's a way of looking at food that has taken over our minds and our diets, much to the detriment, I think, of our happiness, but also, as I hope to prove to you, our health as well. Nutritionism, like most ideologies, is a way of kind of organizing everyday life and experience without even realizing you're doing that. It's a set of unspoken assumptions and unexamined assumptions. In the case of nutritionism, I'll run through for you what some of those assumptions are. The basic idea, though, is that the key unit when you're looking at food is not the food itself, but the nutrient. And if you think about it, over the last 20 or 30 years, our heads are stuffed with chemistry, biochemistry. We all talk about antioxidants and cholesterol and fiber and vitamins and phytochemicals and resveratrol and polyphenols and all this stuff. It's really kind of bizarre that we all speak in chemicals now when we talk about food. And if you go down the aisles of your supermarket, you will see that the foods are kind of fading from view, and coming forward on all the labels are these chemicals. Where else in life do we have such an acquaintance with biochemistry? So the idea, though, that the nutrients are the key thing, and when we're eating, we're trying to get the right collection of nutrients. That's the first premise, that a food is essentially the sum of its nutrient parts, okay? Something that I think many of us accept without a moment's thought. Second assumption, if nutrients are the key unit in foods, and they are invisible, who's ever seen a nutrient? We need experts to tell us how to eat. Only the scientists with their microscopes can see these little things, and that we need a priesthood. Because like many things that are holy and invisible, we require a priesthood to mediate our relationship to it. And so we have fallen in the realm of food into a dependence on doctors, perplexing food pyramids from the government and various pronouncements from the USDA and the FDA and the Surgeon General, the health columns in the newspaper, food journalism. All of this, we can't seem to make a move when it comes to food without consulting an expert. Very weird idea, very novel idea in the history of our species. Third assumption, that, like all ideologies, nutritionism divides the world into good and evil, so that at any given moment in America, there is a satanic nutrient that we are trying to drive from the food supply. At the moment, it's the trans fat. For a long time, it was saturated fat. And on the other hand, there is a blessed savior nutrient that will rescue us and make us well and whole again. And right now, it's the omega-3 fatty acid. For a long time, it was the polyunsaturated fatty acid, till we found out that we were turning those into trans fats. And so we're always dividing our nutritional universe into good and evil, and we have this Manichaean war of nutrient against nutrient, and it's fats versus carbs, and protein versus carbs during the last century. And we just seem to organize our whole food experience against the nutrient that's going to make us sick and the nutrient that's going to save our lives. This is very bizarre. I'm trying to bring a kind of man from Mars point of view to our thinking about food. And the fourth assumption, and this is the one that might seem the least controversial to you, is that the reason we eat, the whole point of eating, is to advance a very narrow view of bodily health. Now, while it is true we need to eat to stay alive, people eat for a great many other reasons than either ruining or fixing their health. They eat for pleasure. They eat for community, for what happens around the table, both in terms of the larger community of your friends and your family. They eat for ritual reasons. They eat to assert their identity. We are the people who eats this, and we're not, and we're the people who don't eat that. There are all these different reasons. They're all equally good reasons for eating. But we seem to have reduced everything down to this very narrow focus on health, this narrow sense of what health means. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to write a book on health, to address that and see if I couldn't expand people's sense of what health actually means beyond this narrow sense of long life and fixing up whatever your problems are. You know, it was Hippocrates a long time ago who said, let food be thy medicine. And there are times when food should be your medicine, like when you're sick. But in everyday life, it's not your medicine. It's all these other things. It's pleasure, it's community, it's identity, it's spirituality. And so I'm trying to kind of recover some of those other meanings for eating, for a meal. Now, nutritionism, there were certain red letter days in the history of nutritionism. I spent a lot of time kind of going back in history and see if I could figure out, well, where did we get this weird idea of scientific eating? Because other people around the planet do not share it, by the way. We're pretty unique in this, although our way of looking at food is spreading to the rest of the world. And it turns out in America, the whole idea of scientific eating, of letting the scientists decide, and the quacks decide what we should eat, goes back to the 19th century. It goes back to the 1860s and what was called the New Nutrition, and this effort on the part of various moral reformers to change the American diet. And it shows up around the turn of the last century when you have the first generation of food faddists, John Harvey Kellogg and Horace Fletcher, the great masticator, who believed we should all chew our food 100 times as a way to reduce our health problems. And indeed, if you do chew your food 100 times, you will eat a lot less and you will lose weight. Whether it'll be worth living is another question. So this idea that science could teach us how to eat is an old American idea. I think it grows out of a kind of absence of a strong food culture in our country. Since we are such a mongrel country with so many different immigrant groups, we didn't have a single culture surrounding our food. So we looked for something that would transcend all cultures and tell us how to eat. And that, of course, is always science, which seems so objective and so, to transcend all these kind of narrow considerations. And there was a real effort to get immigrant groups to change the way they eat in the name of science. It didn't appear to moralize to them, but in fact, that's precisely what it was doing. But the modern rise of nutritionism really begins in the 70s. And there are a couple red letter dates that I'll very quickly go through, and then I'd like to read a short passage that gets at what nutritionism has done to the food supply. In 1973, in a very little noticed action by the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, they repealed something called the imitation rule. This was in the 27th paragraph of the article about a set of regulatory changes in the New York Times in 1973. And the imitation rule had held, and the language of it was, there are certain traditional foods that everyone knows, like bread and pasta and milk and sour cream, and that the consumer should expect that those foods are made the way those foods have traditionally been made and don't have any kind of adulterants in them. And if you substantially change the way you're making your bread or pasta or sour cream or yogurt, you couldn't call it those things. You had to call it imitation bread or imitation sour cream or your imitation yogurt. What a radical idea. And this had been part of U.S. law since 1938 when the FDA was formed, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. This rule really bothered the food scientists who really had some, interesting ideas on how to reformulate sour cream or yogurt. But it also appealed to the public health community at the time, which was very eager to get fat out of our diet and create all these low-fat products. And they couldn't do that because you'd have to call it imitation sour cream. And imitation was really the kiss of death in the marketplace. So they petitioned the government, the food industry, with the help of the American Heart Association and some other very well-meaning groups, to get the imitation rule, even though it was an act of Congress, to get it thrown out as a regulatory matter. It's still on the books, and somebody could probably sue successfully to bring it back. And I actually think that would be a really good idea. So after that, in 1973, suddenly you have an explosion of products. And you can add all sorts of things to bread or sour cream or yogurt, and you didn't have to say it was an imitation. That's one red letter day. Very important and little understood event. The next big event, and the really important one, I think, happens in 1977, and that's when George McGovern, who has a select Senate committee on health and nutrition, took hearings to try to get at the bottom of what was thought to be an epidemic of heart disease at the time. And he took testimony and heard from a lot of people who said that, well, the problem is all the red meat people are eating in this country. We're eating too much meat, too much saturated fat, and if we could cut down on that, we would cut down on heart disease. So McGovern drafts these guidelines called the Dietary Guidelines of the United States. It's the first time the government ever decided to tell us how to eat, all of us. There had been particular guidelines for particular populations who had particular deficiencies or whatever, but now for the first time they were trying to change the whole country's diet. He issued in his guidelines, he had words like, eat less red meat. Now, you know, you're here in Iowa, that these are inflammatory words. And indeed, the entire food industry, the ranchers, the food processors, all came down on McGovern like a ton of bricks. And in fact, it's why he lost in 1980. The ranchers organized against him, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. He had violated a very important taboo in America, which is ever telling anyone to eat less of anything. Now, when this firestorm of protest erupted, he was forced to rewrite those guidelines, those seemingly, straightforward guidelines. And they were rewritten in a way so that, ideally no one could understand them and that the beef industry would be satisfied. So he rewrote those, and pork as well. He rewrote those guidelines as follows. From eat less red meat, kind of in English, everyone knows what he means, right? To choose meats that will reduce your saturated fat intake. This pleased everybody, because most people didn't know what it meant. And it also was affirmative. It was saying eat more of something with less of a certain nutrient. It didn't say eat less of anything. So there was no industry group that was really going to be offended, because the saturated fat lobby doesn't exist as such. And beginning with that revision, that little bit of editing, we entered this era of talking about food in terms of nutrients, and we no longer spoke of whole foods as an official matter in government advice. And the National Academy of Science issued a report on cancer and diet 5 years later, and they took the same approach. They said you need lots of vitamin C and beta-carotene. They didn't say eat foods that contain beta-carotene and vitamin C. And so this became the official language of food talk in America. So with those events, we entered on what I call the golden age of food science. I'm going to read you a brief passage. And those of you who were around in the 80s shopping will recognize what I'm talking about. And others, I think, will also recognize, because nothing's changed, except the names of the good and bad nutrients. In the years following the 1977 dietary goals and the 1982 National Academy of Sciences report on diet and cancer, the food industry, armed with its regulatory absolution, the end of the imitation rule, set about re-engineering thousands of popular food products to contain more of the nutrients that science and government had deemed the good ones and fewer of the bad. A golden age for food science dawned. Hyphens sprouted like dandelions in the supermarket aisles, low fat, no cholesterol, high fiber. Ingredient labels on formerly 2 or 3 ingredient foods such as mayonnaise and bread and yogurt ballooned with lengthy lists of new additives, what in a more benighted age would have been called adulterants. The year of eating oat bran, also known as 1988, served as a kind of coming out party for the food scientists who succeeded in getting the material into nearly every processed food sold in America. Oat bran's moment on the dietary stage didn't last long, but the pattern now was set, and every few years then a new oat bran has taken its star under the marketing lights. And here comes omega-3s. You would not think that common food animals could themselves be rejiggered to fit nutritionist fashion, but in fact some of them could be and were in response to the 77 guidelines, as animal scientists figured out how to breed leaner pigs and select for leaner beef. With widespread lipophobia taking hold of the human population, countless cattle lost their marbling, and lean pork was repositioned as the new white meat. Tasteless and tough as running shoes, perhaps, but now even a pork chop could compete with chicken as a way for eaters to reduce their saturated fat intake. In the years since then, egg producers figured out a clever way to redeem even the disreputable egg. By feeding flaxseed to hens, they could elevate levels of omega-3 fatty acids in the yolks. Aiming to do the same thing for pork and beef fat, the animal scientists are now hard at work genetically engineering omega-3 fatty acids into pigs and persuading cattle to munch on flaxseed in the hope of introducing the blessed fish fat where it had never gone before, into hot dogs and hamburgers. But these whole foods are the exceptions. The typical whole food has much more trouble competing under the rules of nutritionism, if only because something like a banana or avocado can't quite as readily change its nutritional stripes. Though rest assured, the genetic engineers are hard at work on the problem. To date, at least, they can't put oat bran in a banana or omega-3s in a peach. So depending on the reigning nutritional orthodoxy, the avocado might either be a high-fat food to be avoided, old think, or a food high in monounsaturated fat, good fats, to be embraced, new think. The fate and supermarket sales of every whole food rises and falls with every change in the nutritional weather, while the processed foods simply get reformulated and differently supplemented. That's why when the Atkins diet storm hit the food industry in 2003, bread and pasta got a quick redesign, dialing back the carbs, boosting the proteins, while the poor, unreconstructed potatoes and carrots were left out in the carbohydrate cold. The low-carb indignities visited on bread and pasta, two formerly traditional foods that everyone knows, would never have been possible had the imitation rule not been tossed out in 1973. After all, who would ever buy imitation spaghetti? But of course, that is precisely what low-carb pasta is. A handful of lucky whole foods has recently gotten the good nutrient marketing treatment. The antioxidants in the pomegranate, a fruit formerly more trouble to eat than it was worth, now protect against cancer and erectile dysfunction. That's right, they have tested this and found that pomegranates help. And they tested it on rabbits, which I found really interesting. I had not thought rabbits had this problem. But evidently they do. A whole subcategory of nutritional science, funded by industry and remarkably reliable in its ability to find a health benefit in whatever food it has been commissioned to study, has sprung up to give a nutritionist sheen to all sorts of foods, including some not ordinarily thought of as healthy. The Mars Corporation recently endowed a chair in chocolate science at the University of California at Davis. I'm not kidding, where research on the antioxidant properties of cacao is making steady breakthroughs, you'll be glad to hear, so it shouldn't be long before we see chocolate bars bearing FDA-approved health claims. And when we do, nutritionism will surely have entered its Baroque phase. Fortunately for everyone playing this game, scientists can find an antioxidant in just about any plant-based food they choose to study. That's why it works. All plants make antioxidants. Yet as a general rule, it's a whole lot easier to slap a health claim on a box of sugary cereal than on a raw potato or a carrot, with the perverse result that the most healthful foods in the supermarket sit there quietly in the produce section, silent as stroke victims, while a few aisles over in cereal, the Cocoa Puffs and Lucky Charms are screaming their newfound whole grain goodness to the rafters. Thank you. Yikes. It's the corn farmers. Now, what's wrong with this way of looking at food, besides the fact that it does ruin a lot of otherwise perfectly good meals? It is not a pleasurable way to eat. It's a very Puritan way to eat. And I think that's really the root of our scientific approach to eating. We have a lot of trouble in this country, since we are descended from Puritans, many of us, in taking pleasure in something so physical as eating. All the things that, all those areas of life where we do what animals do, Puritans have a lot of trouble with. And I think eating is one of those. You know what I mean. Now, the other problem is, for nutritionism to be a good way to approach food, the science has to be really good. If they really knew what nutrients were important to our health, either good or bad, if they could really measure the nutrients, identify the important ones, they would have something. But on close inspection, nutrition science leaves a lot to be desired. And I spent a lot of time examining it very closely. And I was surprised. We know a lot less than we think we know about nutrition science. And it's not surprising. It's a very young science. It's only about 170 years old since we discovered the macronutrients, carbohydrates, protein, and fats. And every 50 years or so, we've realized, oh, we were missing something. When we found those, we said, oh, that's it. That's what we need to be healthy. So we made formula based on carbohydrate, fat, and protein. And lo and behold, the babies got sick. We were missing something. We sent men on long ocean voyages, and we gave them plenty of the big three macronutrients, and they got sick. So what was missing? Well, we finally discovered it was the vitamins. So then we put the vitamins in the food, and everybody was okay for a while. And we made formula based on that. But even that didn't work very well. Why not? Well, we forgot the omega-3 fatty acids. So you see, we keep narrowing we keep finding new levels of complexity in food, and we will find many more. We are not at the bottom. We have not plumbed the depth of a carrot to say what is really going on there. It's too complex. A carrot is a remarkably complex thing. It's a system. It's not just a collection of nutrients. It's constantly changing. These chemicals are, I list in here the antioxidants alone in a single leaf of thyme, and there are 35 of them. And that's what we found so far. So at that end of the food chain, we have great complexity that we have not gotten to the bottom of. On the other end of the food chain, which is to say the human body, we are equally in the dark. Yes, we've learned a lot, but we really don't fully understand the metabolism and how carbohydrates are metabolized, or fats for that matter. We're learning a lot, but we're not there yet. For example, did you know that in your digestive tract you have as many neurons as you have in your spinal column? What are they thinking? It's the Stephen Colbert idea, you know, that you think with your gut. Well, you really do have the cells to do it. But we really don't understand exactly what all those neurons are up to in your digestive tract. So, you know, it's important work to do. I don't mean to take slaps at nutrition science. I look forward to the day where they've gotten to the bottom of all this, and the work needs to be done. But we should realize as eaters that this science is, in my view, it's sort of where surgery was in 1650. Really promising, really interesting to watch. But are you ready to get on the table? Are you ready to let it shape your life? I don't think so, unless you're desperately sick. Until then, you wait. You wait till they develop anesthesia and understand the germ theory of disease and all that kind of stuff. The other problem with nutritionism, though, and we do have lots of evidence that, in fact, it hasn't worked. I mean, the main public health nutritionist message from beginning in the 70s, that fat was the great dietary evil, led to a great deal of mischief, and is turning out not to be true. That lipid hypothesis, if you read the scientific literature, even though they haven't changed the labels in the supermarket yet, and nobody has stepped out here to tell you, sorry, everything we told you about fat and diet for the last 30 years is not true, that is where they are right now. And that they have learned that, in fact, there are many fats that are critically important to you. They have learned, in fact, that refined carbohydrates may be just as serious a cause, if not more so, in heart disease and many other diseases of inflammation, as they're now recognized to be. But they have not told us. Scientists never do that when a paradigm collapses. They just move on to the next one and hope nobody really notices. Or they start saying, oh, we knew that all along. What were you thinking? But that's where we are with the dietary fat hypothesis. So as a matter of efficacy, nutritionism has failed us. My biggest objection to it, though, is that it completely overlooks what is the elephant in the room. Indeed, nutritionism is a way to avoid talking about the elephant in the room. And that elephant is the Western diet. The fact is, nutritionism, in a way, arose to deal with a real problem. It just dealt with it in the wrong way. We know this, at the bottom of all the science, and we have known for more than 100 years, that people who eat the way we do, which is to say, lots of refined grain, lots of free sugars, lots of added fat, lots of processed foods, lots of bread and processed meat, very few vegetables, fruits, and whole grains. People who eat that fast food diet reliably get chronic diseases. And every population around the world that has adopted that disease saw those chronic diseases for the first time. Obesity, followed by diabetes, followed by coronary heart disease, and followed by a specific set of diet-related cancers. We know this is what happens. And in fact, back when this was first observed by a group of medical workers, including Albert Schweitzer and others that you haven't heard of, working in Africa and working in Asia, they called these the Western diseases. Because although they were common in England and in America, these medical workers who were working in the developing world did not see them. They did not see cancers of the digestive tract or breast cancers. They did not see heart disease. They did not see diabetes at all. So we knew this, and we called this the Western diet, and we understood its link to to the Western diseases. We managed to forget this. We got consumed in a scientific race to figure out what in the Western diet was causing these problems. And that's where we got into this. Is it the saturated fat? Is it the processing? Is it the refined carbohydrates and the sugar? And that's the debate that's all over that we read. That constant sniping back and forth on all the different sides of the nutritional argument. But for us as people trying to eat now, we don't really need to know why the Western disease does this. To know, we should try not to eat this way. It's really simple. And if you don't eat this way, many of these chronic diseases can be rolled back. And that too has been proven. There are wonderful examples of taking populations that left their traditional diet, who have the biggest problem with the Western disease. We've seen with Mexicans coming to America, Hawaiian Islanders, Eskimos, that when they start eating this way for the first time, they get sick really quickly. And when we put those people back on their traditional diets, Hawaiians going back to eating taro and their traditional plant-based diet in Hawaii, or Aborigines going back to the bush and eating their wild food diet, their symptoms vanish. Now the challenge for us is, and one other related point is, one of the things that these researchers found is that the variety of traditional diets to which the human body appears exquisitely well adapted is huge. There is no one proper way to eat. You've got Maasai warriors who eat a diet essentially of blood from cattle and milk and meat, one of the healthiest populations in the world. You've got the Eskimos of Greenland eating, seal blubber and lichens, not too much else. They have no diabetes at all, and no heart disease to speak of, until they move to Canada and start eating a Western diet. You've got Mexicans who subsist largely on corn and beans, very, very healthy. So there's a starchy plant-based diet. So the human body is adapted to a great many different diets. There is, in fact, only one to which we are really poorly adapted, and it happens to be the one most of us are eating. What an achievement, for thousands of years of civilization, that we should have devised the one diet that makes people sick. How could that happen? And a lot of this book is telling the story of how that did happen. So the question is, the challenge for all of us is, how do you get off the Western diet without leaving civilization? I'm sure you're not ready to go back to the bush. Although I did do some hunting and gathering in Omnivore's Dilemma. You don't want people like me in the woods with guns, believe me. And so the last third of this book is an attempt to come up with some rules of eating that would be very concrete, very helpful. They're not science-based rules. Because what I learned very quickly is that, of course, science is not the only source of authority when it comes to what to eat. People ate very well for thousands of years without scientists telling them what to eat. People ate very well for thousands of years without knowing what an antioxidant is. You do not need to know the meaning of any of these words. We can clear our mind of that vocabulary, that crazy chemical vocabulary. Let the doctors hold on to it. Let the nutrition scientists continue with their experiments till they nail it all down. But for us, we can skip it. And this book is an attempt to show you how to skip it. The other source of wisdom, of course, that's always been there when it comes to food, we still have, and that is culture. Culture is really just a fancy word for your mom, okay? For generations and generations, it has been mothers who told you, think about it, who originally told you what to eat, when to eat it, how much to eat, what to eat it with, what order in which to eat it, what fork to eat it with. All that stuff is food culture, and all that stuff contains wisdom, or did before food marketing displaced mom and dad as the gatekeepers of the family meal. So the challenge is, what can we learn from culture? There is such wisdom in culture. There's wisdom in the cuisines that are out there. When the Mexicans figured out that you should eat beans with corn, there was no scientist telling them about amino acids and how to balance them off. Through trial and error, culture is the distilled wisdom of the group. It's not just myth and folklore. So how can we recover that? And so I have a series of rules, and I'm not going to go into great detail. I'll tell you some of them. just to give you the flavor of what I'm doing. But one of the things I say is, don't eat any foods that your great-grandmother wouldn't recognize as a food. It's pretty straightforward. I wish my doctor had told me that. It would sure simplify things. And so you imagine you're rolling down the aisles in the supermarket, and imagine your great-grandmother. Depending on your age, it may just be your grandmother, or or you may need to consult your great-great-grandmother. You want a figure in your family who's predates World War II at least. And you're rolling down the aisles, and she picks up the Go-Gurt portable yogurt tubes. Is she going to recognize that as food? Is she going to know what you do with one of those tubes? It could be toothpaste. How do you get it into your body? How does this work? And if she looked at the ingredients, would she know that that was yogurt? There are 10 or 15 other ingredients in there that have nothing to do with yogurt that a first grader couldn't pronounce. So that's not food. That's not food. And the supermarket is full of what I call edible food-like substances. And the challenge then is distinguishing the food, which is, all we need to do to be healthy is just to eat food from the edible food-like substances. And I have lots of rules for that. The grandmother rule. Another is, shop the periphery of the store, because most of the whole foods, and there are a couple exceptions, the ones that have been fiddled with least in the last 75 or 100 years are lining the edge of the perimeter of the store. That's where the produce is, the meat, the fish, the dairy products, although exceptions like Go-Gurt are infiltrating that. And in subtler ways, industrialization has already influenced all that food. And I urge people to really, when they can afford it or have access to it, to pay attention to how their food was grown. What did the cattle eat? The diet of your meat animals matters to you too, has a bearing on your health. The health of the soil in which the food is grown has a bearing on your health. So that's the ideal case, well-grown food, local, seasonal. But, we don't let the ideal be an enemy of the good. So shop the perimeter of the store. Some of these rules you'll recognize if you're old enough. But remember in the 70s, people say, don't eat anything that is incapable of rotting. That's a really good rule of thumb. There's a lot of food in the store. You try it. It will never go bad. I mean, I bought a Twinkie when I was working on my last book for research. It was a prop at a talk, and I have it on the shelf in my office, and every few weeks I give it a little squeeze, and it's as soft as the day I bought it. Now, what does that mean? I'll tell you what it means. It means that the microbes, the bacteria and fungus, have no interest in that food. They know it has no nutritional value. They're smarter than we are. So if the microbes are not competing with us for it, or even the rats and the mice, if they're not interested, it's not food. And that's the story of white flour, of course. I mean, we refined it partly for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons we came up with white flour is we wanted something that would be shelf stable. Okay, it wouldn't go bad. Well, what it means when you say something won't go bad is that the various creatures that make things go bad are not interested in it. And that's true for white flour as well. That's why it lasts so long. Don't eat anything that doesn't rot. See if I can give you one more. Oh, I also have a series that have to do with how to eat. Because what we eat is an issue, but how we eat matters too. And the way Americans are eating has become part of the problem. We've become snackers. The food industry has persuaded us that we should be eating about 24/7. And if you look at the ads, so many of them show us eating in front of the TV, eating on the run as we run down the street or in the car, where we're now eating 20% of our food is being eaten in the car today. It's very much in the industry's interest to overthrow the meal and get us to eat all day long. You eat more when you eat all day long. Meals are ways to moderate appetite. And if you're snacking, you have no idea how much you're eating unless you're at the bottom of the bag, whatever you're eating from. And when I was young, there was this kind of mild taboo attached to the snack. There was the between meal snack you were supposed to avoid. But they've really exploded that whole idea. How you eat, the size of the portions, all these kind of things matter too. And one of my tips is eat at a table. Radical, right? And no, a desk is not a table. I mean, think about how much food is in the workplace. So actually, I'm collecting these tips because cultures are full of them, and I'm running into people who've got a grandmother who would say something, that we now recognize as really wise. Like somebody at a talk recently said, well, my grandmother used to say, the whiter the bread, the sooner you'll be dead. These are good, memorable rules. So if you have one and you would send it to me, care of my website, that would be really wonderful. I'd love to stop now and take a couple questions from you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I will make sure to look over here now, too.
You should look over there, make sure that they're happy with what we're doing, what you're doing. This is Live from Prairie Lights, and Michael Pollan's our guest, a special edition. We're broadcasting from the Iowa City Public Libraries, and he has invited the audience here to talk with him. There's a microphone in front here. If you would come up and use the microphone so that listeners can hear what you're asking, we'd appreciate that. So if you have questions or comments for Michael Pollan, this is a good time to step up to the microphone. Michael Pollan, I'm going to start off here and just, there's so much to talk to you about, but I wanted to go way back to when you realized what you were doing as far as your eating habits. Obviously, it started with something personal, it seems to me. So give us an anecdote about what was your aha moment, if you will?
Well, I had a couple. When I was writing Botany of Desire, which is a book that kind of grew out of my gardening as much as anything else, it's a book about our relationship to a set of 4 plants. The last of the plants that I looked at was genetically modified potatoes, which I'd grown in my garden, and to see what that was all about. This is very early on, shortly after they were introduced. And I spent a lot of time at Monsanto, and they took me to see the farms where people were growing genetically modified potatoes out in Idaho. And I hadn't seen industrial agriculture before. I hadn't seen perfectly clean fields without a single weed, and earth that was like sand. It had no tilth to it at all. And farmers who were afraid to go out in their fields after they sprayed with fungicide because it was so toxic. They would wait 5 days. Even if they lost their irrigation in that 5 days, they would not fix it. I was shocked, and that these potatoes were inedible for 5 or 6 months until they'd off-gassed all these poisons, and that the farmers growing small plots of organic potatoes by the house. So that was one moment. And then the second moment was being on a feedlot in Garden City, Kansas, and learning how we were growing beef in this country, and learning that we were feeding them corn that they're very poorly adapted to eat in those quantities, 80–90% corn diets, and that they must be given drugs to keep them alive. And that even with that, their livers are too scarred to be eaten anymore. And that, this had all become normal in America. And very few of us have been on a feedlot, probably more here than in a lot of places. And it puts you off your feed. And it makes you sense that, well, there's something wrong with the way we're growing food in this country. So that really began my journey.
Michael Pollan's our guest. In Defense of Food, and Eater's Manifesto is his new book. And there's a question?
Yes. I'm a friend of George Naylor and a colleague of him in the Iowa CCI and the National Family Farm Coalition. I've been working pretty seriously on the Farm Bill issues for more than 20 years, and I've never seen so many people involved in it.
Yeah.
I've also never seen so much confusion or misunderstanding about the commodity title. You're one of the few people who does understand the commodity title from our perspective. And now I just bought your book here. I haven't read it, but I see that I didn't see the Farm Bill cited. I wondered if you would comment on
Sure.
The commodity title in particular. I know obviously the research title has, and others have to do with this, but what it might relate to this new book.
Okay, yeah, sure. Before I start talking about the Farm Bill, will you lock that door so no one can leave? It's a dangerous topic to talk about, but it's a really important topic. And I don't talk about the Farm Bill very much in this book. I'm trying to reach people through another door, which is to say through concern with their own health, and invite them to join this movement that's renovating the food supply and farm policy in a somewhat indirect way, actually. I talk more directly about the Farm Bill and agricultural policy and Omnivore's dilemma. And I've been writing a lot about it. I've written 4 articles this year on the Farm Bill. I don't think I've ever written 4 articles on anything. Because I came to learn, and partly with the help of George Naylor and Kathy Ozer and the people at the National Family Farms Coalition, who are doing really great work on this issue, that it is key to reforming the food supply, that as much as we can all vote with our forks for a new kind of food. And that's very important. And this book is really an effort to get people to vote with their forks. In the end, we also need to vote with our votes and change agricultural policy. The Western diet prevails in part because the least healthy calories in the supermarket are the ones that the government is encouraging farmers to overproduce. And that is to say, added fat from soy and added sweeteners from corn. Farm policy has been organized in the last 30 years or so in such a way not to support prices, which formerly is what it did, and it helped farmers by holding up prices, but to encourage overproduction by essentially cutting them checks and encouraging them to sell into an ever-weakening market, although we have the anomaly of this ethanol boom right now. So if we really want to make the healthy, and so with the result of that system, that since the 70s, when the epidemic of obesity begins, we have seen the price of sweetened foods and processed foods decline in real dollars, and we've seen the price of real whole foods like fruits and vegetables rise. We have a situation now where if you're on a fixed income, if you're, say you're that food stamp recipient with $65 a week to feed a family of 4, and you're buying calories with that dollar, make no mistake, because that's all you can afford to buy, calories to keep your family going. If you've got $1, you will end up in the processed food aisles because you can get 1,250 calories with the chips or the cookies or the processed foods. If you take that dollar into the produce aisle, not a good idea. You're only going to get 250 calories of carrots. So why is this? Well, because of the way we've organized the rules of the game. Now, it's a very complicated story to tell people. And what ends up happening is critics of this farm system end up attacking subsidies per se. And I think this was an enormous error that the critics made in this debate, and one of the reasons that we did not succeed in getting much serious reform, no reform of the commodity title at all. We demonized subsidies. But one of the things I learned from George Naylor and various agricultural economists I talked to is that simply eliminating subsidies is not going to solve this problem of overproduction of cheap calories. That farmers in Iowa will continue to produce lots of corn at falling prices, unless ethanol keeps them going. But the same thing will happen with soy. We need more complicated solutions. And in fact, all the critics, and this goes, I think, for George's group, did not put forth compelling enough counter-proposals that would help the farmers and also give us healthier food, real food. And the work still needs to be done in crafting those proposals because it isn't really clear that we can simply turn back the clock and go back to the kinds of price supports we had. It's hard to do in a global economy. It then leads to tariffs and protectionism and a whole lot of things that are just politically unpalatable right now. So the challenge now for anyone who follows farm policy, and you can unlock the door in a second, is crafting proposals that will appeal to at least a portion of the farmers, but that will achieve these goals of renovating the food supply. And that's the work that needs to be done over the next 5 years. Simply getting up and talking about welfare farmers receiving these handouts from the government is only going to make people dig in their heels, and it's only going to actually stop reform because we're not going to eliminate subsidies. There are too many powers benefit from that. The banking system would probably collapse if we simply eliminated subsidies. That's not the goal. The goal is to figure out a way to support farmers and encourage them to grow the kind of food we all should be eating. Thanks.
Michael Pollan's our guest, and In Defense of Food is his book, and there's another question.
And that brings up the next question. I've been in correspondence with a friend who is, her husband is a beef farmer in Hokkaido, Japan, and she's just finished The Omnivore's Dilemma, and we both had the same plaint, which was somebody reading The Omnivore's Dilemma who did not know the areas that you spoke about. In the first section of The Omnivore's Dilemma, it would be easy to assume that there's no hunting and gathering and not much community-supported agriculture going on in Iowa, when that's far from the case. Lots of corn-fed venison here. And
You encourage that, huh?
well, at least the hunting, yeah.
Yeah.
And so the question I have, and it may be answered in Defense of Food, is what proposals do you have for encouraging omnivores, local omnivores?
Well, one of the things I've learned is that obviously Iowa is not a monolith, and it's easy to caricature it, and that there is, especially in this community, I've learned just in the last day, a very lively food movement going on here. It's very exciting to see. The New Pioneer Co-op, who I neglected to thank for sponsoring this event, and the local slow food movement doing really good work. And so there's a lot happening here. And I had 2 meals that consisted, since I got here, of local food. And here we are in the depths of winter, and delicious meals consisting of local food. So there is a lot going on, but there could be a whole lot more. I mean, you guys have the best soil in the country. You may not have the best weather, but you've got the best soil in the country. You can grow anything here, with the exception of those pomegranates and perhaps a couple other things. Iowa could feed itself. Iowa used to feed itself. The average farm in Iowa had 13 or 14 different crops 50 years ago. Now it has 2. And so, if we eat omnivorously, if we eat locally, then Iowa farmers will begin feeding us again. And I think that that's, very important work to do. The fact is, one of the problems with the Farm Bill, which surprises people, is that if you receive subsidies, you are forbidden from growing fruits and vegetables to protect the guys in California. That was a deal they worked out. The California big farmers left the Iowa ones alone in exchange for this trade-off. So if you take money from the government at all, you're out of the game of growing real food. So that's something that needs to be changed too. So I'm very hopeful of what's going to happen in places like Iowa. There's a misconception in the media that the movement around renovating the food system, the movement about eating locally, eating seasonally, is limited to the 2 coasts. And people would say, why are you going on a book tour in the Midwest, where I've been for the last several days? And I said, well, there's a lot going on there too. You don't realize it. This is there are pockets, and there still are. There are food deserts in Iowa. There's no question there are food deserts in Iowa. But that's not all of Iowa. So I think, given the quality of the soil, and if you go back, and there are really interesting lists of what you found on the average Iowa farm in 1920. Really good apples, very good chicken, very good. There was great grass. I mean, it's a great place to fatten cattle here, back on the farms. So I think there's vast potential for Iowa, and I hope I didn't leave a caricatured portrait in my book, because as I say, it's all about healthy soil, and you guys have some wonderful soil here. Anybody else? But you're very shy.
I've been a fan of yours for a long time. One of my favorite articles of yours is the one about the poppies that was in Harper's years ago. If you could give me the title of that again, I'd love to download it somewhere.
Opium Made Easy.
Oops.
There's a crop.
But you've always written about plants from such a delightfully entertaining and informative stance, and you have such a good venue for pulling in a large audience. Have you ever thought of taking on corn and switchgrass and ethanol production? Because no one's writing about that in an entertaining and informative manner.
It's definitely on my list of things I want to write this year, is a piece on ethanol, because I've been watching this unfold, and I'm very concerned about it. I'm very concerned about it from the point of view of the food economy and what it's going to do to the food economy. But also, it's such just a false hope. I mean, the amount of environmental damage being done in the name of this supposedly green technology is outrageous. I mean, people going to corn-on-corn rotations because corn prices are so high. Don't people realize that all that nitrogen fertilizer gets turned into nitrous oxide, which is a much worse greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide? Don't people see how much fossil fuel is going into growing that corn, and how much fossil fuel goes into distilling that ethanol and transporting that ethanol? This is, I think it's one of the great boondoggles of our time, and I think that it's been a boon for corn farmers right now, but in the end, it won't be. It never is. These high prices will lead people to do some really dumb things, and prices will collapse once again, and we'll be back where we start. So it does need to be written about, and there has been some writing about it. It's an odd issue, because if you read widely and carefully, you see that all the facts are out there. People know that this is not a very good way to generate energy, but nevertheless, we're moving forward. I mean, how is that? How can you do this? And, you know, when we look back on this fiasco and realize, God, what a mistake. I guess we didn't know what we were doing. No, we did know what we were doing, and we're doing it anyway.
Michael Pollan's our guest on Life in Prairie Lights in Defense of Food. Eater's Manifesto is his latest book. I wanted to ask you, is there some place in this country where there is a business that's going to be comparable to McDonald's, but only on the more healthy side of things? I know McDonald's and all those fast foods are trying to do what they think is right, but I mean, do you see that fast food industry becoming good food industry?
You know, that's a really interesting kind of thought experiment, whether the answer is healthy, organic fast food. And there are people working on that, and there's some pilot chains getting started. I know of one in New England. And, you know, it might be a good idea. I mean, I think you've got to meet people where they are. I'm kind of an incrementalist. You know, if Alice Waters were here, she'd be like outraged that I'm saying this. Oh, you're broadcasting this. You know, there are times where that's what you need to feed your kids, and you're on the highway. And wouldn't it be great if there were a good alternative at the rest stop? And you know, I could even make a case that organic Coca-Cola might not be the worst thing in the world. You know, it's not going to be health food, and it will fool people into thinking it is health food because the word organic has that halo. But think about all the acres of corn that would not receive atrazine if we had organic Coca-Cola. Because we'd need all that organic high fructose corn syrup. So it's a mixed thing. But I think, you know, from the point of view of the water table, from the point of view of the frogs that are going to be, you know, chemically neutered by all that atrazine, it's a positive thing. So I think we will see organic fast food, but I think we also shouldn't lose track of the fact that we should be eating meals and we should be cooking meals. And cooking is a very big part of the solution. It's really, so many of our problems have to do with the fact that we've spent the last 50 years essentially outsourcing our food preparation to corporations. And they're not cooking very well for us. And they're giving us processed food. They're giving us microwavable food. They're giving us food with tons of high fructose corn syrup and added fat. And so we have to take back control over our meals. And yes, that takes more time, and it may take more money. But that's the choice. You know, do we become the Lipitor nation? Do we become the place where in the inner city there's a dialysis center on every corner, you know, next to the check cashing center? Or do we change the way we eat? And I think it's a pretty straightforward choice. The healthcare industry is happy to go down the other path. They make a lot of money on Lipitor. They make a lot of money on diabetes. The economics of amputations are better than the economics of prevention because of our healthcare system. But for us, it's not the way to go.
Time for another question.
One little food absurdity and then a question. There is a local grocery store that will sell you, wrapped in cellophane, an Idaho potato for 99 cents with a sticker on it that says microwave ready.
We needed that.
My question is, and I am accusing no one of plagiarism, okay? But I read The Omnivore's Dilemma and Barbara Kingsolver's Animal Vegetable Miracle back to back. The central arguments are so similar. I wondered if you could talk about how that might have happened, what's going on there.
What a great question to go out on. Huh?
I know, Barbara. And we've talked about this subject before. We were at a conference in Kentucky, actually, where we talked quite a bit about food. And, you know, I don't think of myself as an original thinker. I think a lot of what's going on, and maybe she does, but maybe she, you know, but my guess is she feels the same way. I think my pub date was first, right? But we are both picking up the thread of a conversation that began in this country in the 1970s. It's really striking. If you go back and read Wendell Berry, The Unsettling of America, or Francis Moore Lepay, which I think is like 1980, or Joan Gussow, who nobody, you know, very few people have heard of, but it was a wonderful writer, nutritionist, writing this stuff in the 70s. This conversation was happening then. It was circled around energy, organized around energy, because we had the energy crisis, and the energy inputs of agriculture were very front and center. But this conversation started then, and then it was stillborn. Reagan essentially killed it off, as he killed off the whole conversation about energy and our dependence on foreign oil. And it has come back. It's come back a little different because our concerns are different. There wasn't a public health crisis around food back in the 70s yet. We hadn't gotten so fat or diabetic yet. So the conversation has much more of a health dimension to it than it did back then. But it's the same conversation. I'm not saying anything that Wendell Berry wasn't saying in the 1970s. Go back and see. I mean, he's a great hero of mine, and I quote him extensively. So I see this as a common work. I don't see it as a quest for originality. And a lot of the wisdom in this book is, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants like him and like Frances Moore LePay and Joan Gussow and Marion Nestle, a very good nutritionist today, and Barbara too. And so, I don't see any kind of conflict there.
Do you have another book coming out? I mean, are you working
Please.
I know, but I meant...
This just came out last week. I just finished it.
I know, and it's #1 on the bestsellers, the New York Times bestsellers list. But are you contemplating writing another book about
Well, I
something?
will write another book.
Okay, we hope you come back.
I can't be stopped, but
Okay.
I don't have another idea.
Okay.
Not yet.
You'll be welcome in Iowa, I'm sure.
Thank you.
Michael Pollan, thank you so much for being on this edition.
Thank
of
you.
Hyper Lights.
Thank you
In
very
Defense of
much.
Food is his
Thanks for your
new
great
book.
question.
Tim Davies engineered this edition. I'm Julie Englander.
Thank you. Yeah, are you talking? Oh, thank you. You're very kind. Thank you, Julie. Thanks. I will be signing books right up here. Thanks a lot.